Some stories are not just history. They are warnings etched into the bedrock of human memory, reminding us that the most beautiful paths often lead to the most violent ends. We like to think that evil wears a hideous face, a mask of monstrosity that repels us instantly. But the oldest records of our civilization tell a different, far more unsettling truth. In the dawn of time, there was a land that didn't just whisper promises of paradise. It shouted them, a landscape so lush and intoxicating that it concealed a deadly secret beneath its emerald surface. It was here, in a valley that looked like the garden of God, that a single choice sealed a destiny where beauty acted as the camouflage for the deepest, most wretched depravity known to man. We are going back to the era just after the great purifying waters of the flood had receded, when the earth was still young and breathing under the heavy, electric atmosphere of a divine promise. This is not a fable about bad luck. It is a forensic examination of a catastrophe that began not with fire from the sky, but with a look of longing in the eyes of a man who thought he could dance on the edge of the abyss without falling in. The narrative centers on two men, bound by blood but separated by the posture of their hearts. There was Abram, whom the Creator himself would rename Abraham, the father of multitudes, a man who walked with a gaze fixed on the invisible. And there was his nephew Lot, a man whose vision was entirely consumed by the visible world. The blessing of God rested upon Abraham with such overwhelming weight that it began to warp the physical reality around them. This was not merely having a few extra coins. This was an industrial-scale abundance. Abraham prospered greatly, and Lot, riding in the wake of his uncle's favor, saw his own fortunes explode in magnitude. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of their success. Their flocks of sheep, goats, and cattle multiplied so aggressively that the horizon was darkened by their moving masses. Their tents, their servants, and their possessions grew so vast that the land itself, the very geography they stood upon, seemed to shrink, groaning under the burden of their combined wealth. The earth was too small to contain the magnitude of this shared blessing, and as it often happens in the history of empires and families, great material abundance brought with it the poisonous seed of discord. The air in the camp, once filled with the sounds of worship and family unity, began to vibrate with the sharp metallic tang of aggression. Strife did not come from outside. It rose from within, festering between the herdsmen tending Abraham's flocks and those tending Lot's animals. Picture the scene at the watering holes, the life-blood of the desert. These were not polite disagreements. These were desperate, sweaty, violent confrontations over scarce water wells and the prime pastures necessary to keep their massive investments alive. The dust of the Canaanite sun mixed with the rising tempers of men who were ready to kill for grass and water. The shadows of division and conflict began to loom over these close relatives, threatening to tear the family apart from the inside out. Abraham, a man of profound peace and a deep, anchoring faith in Yahweh, looked at the situation and realized that the blessing had become a burden. He understood with a wisdom that transcended economics that to preserve the family harmony, they would need to sever their physical proximity. The confrontation that followed was quiet, tense, and defined by a staggering act of humility that would ripple through eternity. Abraham, the patriarch, the elder, the one who held every cultural and legal right to command and choose, took Lot to a high vantage point. The wind whipped around them as Abraham spoke, offering a peaceful solution that defied the logic of power. He begged Lot, "Let there be no strife between us, nor between my herdsmen and yours, for we are brothers, we are family." He swept his hand across the horizon, gesturing to the rugged hills and the distant valleys. "Is not the whole land before you? It is vast and sufficient for both of us." And then, the offer that tested the soul of his nephew. "I ask you to separate from me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. And if you choose the right, I will go to the left." It was a blank check. It was a test of character disguised as a real estate transaction. Abraham yielded the first choice, trusting in the invisible God to sustain him in the rocky hills, leaving the visible glory for Lot to claim or reject. This is the moment where the camera of history zooms in on Lot's eyes. He did not look up to heaven. He did not look at his uncle with gratitude. Lot lifted his eyes and scanned the horizon, and what he saw stopped his breath. He saw the plain of the Jordan. In that era, before the fire and brimstone had scrubbed it from the map, that valley was a paradise. It was well-watered everywhere, lush, verdant, and fertile. It reminded Lot of the legends of the Garden of Eden or the agricultural superpower of Egypt near the Nile. It was a land that didn't just whisper survival. It shouted easy wealth, material prosperity, and ultimate comfort. Lot's eyes fixed on the earthly beauty, on the seductive promise of the world, and in that split second, he calculated his future based solely on optics. He saw the green grass. He ignored the moral rot. He saw the water. He ignored the blood. Lot made his decision based on what his eyes beheld, declaring, "I choose for myself all the plain of the Jordan." And so the separation began. Lot gathered his possessions, his livestock, and his family, and journeyed eastward, physically parting ways with the man who carried the covenant of God. But this was not just a geographic move. It was a spiritual drift. The text tells us he settled his tents progressively. He didn't move into the heart of darkness all at once. He drew closer and closer, inch by inch, until he eventually established himself in the city of Sodom, one of the principal cities of that plain. He had chosen proximity to apparent urban prosperity, drawn in by the gravity of civilization, but the beauty of the plain hid a deep, pulsating corruption. The Bible issues a chilling warning at this stage, a foreshadowing that Lot chose to ignore. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful before the Lord. Their material prosperity had not produced gratitude. It had produced an overwhelming pride and a defiant arrogance that dared to spit in the face of the heavens. Lot had planted his home and family at the very edge of a moral abyss, seduced by the visible wealth, completely blind to the terrible invisible cost that choice was about to extract from his soul. He thought he was moving into paradise, but he was setting up camp in the antechamber of hell. While Lot grew comfortable in the shadow of sin, Abraham remained in the high country, continuing his pilgrimage of faith. But the silence of the desert was about to be broken. One day, as the midday sun scorched the Canaanite land, Abraham sat at the entrance of his tent, unaware that the universe was about to shift. He lifted his eyes and saw 3 men standing before him, visitors who carried the weight of the cosmos in their stride. The countdown to the greatest catastrophe of the ancient world had officially begun. The silence of the desert noon is not peaceful. It is heavy, a crushing weight of heat that presses the life out of everything that breathes. The sun was not merely shining. It was assaulting the earth, scorching the Canaanite land with a ferocity that drove every living creature into the deepest shadows they could find. The air shimmered with the kind of heat distortions that make the horizon dance and blur, turning the solid world into a mirage. In this suffocating stillness, amidst the oaks of Mamre, an event was about to unfold that would shatter the barrier between the finite and the infinite. Abraham, the man who had walked away from his homeland on a whisper from the divine, sat at the entrance of his tent, seeking the faintest breath of a breeze. He was 99 years old, a man whose skin was etched with the map of a century of sun and sand, his eyes holding the quiet resolve of someone who has spent a lifetime listening to the voice of the invisible God. But on this day, the invisible was about to become terrifyingly visible. As he sat there, suspended in the lethargy of the midday swelter, something shifted in the atmosphere. A sudden change in the air pressure, a static charge that pricked the skin before the eyes could even register the source. Abraham lifted his eyes from the dust and looked toward the horizon. Standing there, manifesting out of the heat haze, without the sound of a footfall or the announcing cloud of dust that usually accompanies travelers, were three men. They stood in a triangular formation, silent, immobile, and radiating a presence that made the very air around them vibrate. To the untrained eye, they might have looked like weary wayfarers, perhaps merchants or nobles from a distant land, dusty from the road. But Abraham possessed a spiritual perception sharpened by decades of obedience, and his soul recognized them instantly. These were not mere mortals. Two of them carried the terrible, disciplined grace of warrior angels, beings of immense power restrained within human form. But the third figure, the one in the center, emanated an authority so absolute, so crushing in its majesty, that it brought the patriarch to his feet in a surge of adrenaline that defied his age. Scripture tells us that as soon as he saw them, Abraham ran. He didn't walk. He didn't call out a greeting from his seat. He sprinted from the entrance of his tent to meet them, his heart pounding, not from exertion, but from the terrifying realization that the court of heaven had just landed on his doorstep. In an act of profound humility and instinctive worship, he threw himself into the dust, bowing his face to the ground before the leader of the trio. This was the hospitality of the ancient Near East, yes, but it was elevated to a desperate, trembling adoration. He addressed the central figure not as a guest, but as Adonai, my Lord. Abraham's voice, perhaps shaking with the magnitude of the encounter, broke the silence. My Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass by your servant. It was a plea for connection, a beg for the divine to linger in the mortal realm for just a moment longer. He offered the basics of desert survival, but framed them as offerings to royalty. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. He offered a morsel of bread to refresh their hearts, a humble understatement for the feast he was already planning in his mind. The principal visitor accepted the offer with a divine simplicity that is almost unsettling. The creator of the galaxies agreeing to sit under a tree and wait for lunch. Do as you have said, he replied. The interaction is brief, but the subtext is oceanic. The God of the universe had paused his cosmic administration to accept a piece of bread from a nomad. Abraham scrambled into action, the lethargy of the heat instantly forgotten. He hurried into the tent to Sarah, his wife, his voice urgent and hushed. "Quickly," he commanded, "make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes." This was not ordinary flour. It was the finest, the best they had, reserved for royalty. Sarah, catching the urgency in her husband's tone, began to work the dough, her hands moving fast, sensing that this was no ordinary visit. Meanwhile, Abraham ran to the herd. He didn't delegate this initially. He used his own eyes to select a sacrifice. He chose a calf, tender and good, an animal in its prime, and gave it to a young man to prepare it without delay. The camp became a flurry of activity centered around the 3 silent figures waiting under the oak tree. The smell of roasting meat began to mingle with the scent of baking bread, rising like incense in the hot afternoon air. When everything was ready, Abraham took butter, fresh milk, cool and soothing against the heat, and the meat of the calf, and set the feast before them. And then, in one of the most surreal images in Holy Scripture, Abraham stood by them under the tree, watching as they ate. The Almighty, clothed in the dust of the earth, partook of human sustenance. It was a moment of intimacy that bridged the gap between the clay and the potter. But as the meal concluded, the atmosphere shifted from the warmth of hospitality to the cold, sharp steel of judgment. The pleasantries of the table faded, replaced by a gravity that made the shadows seem to lengthen unnaturally. The purpose of this visit was not merely social, it was judicial. The 2 men who flanked the Lord, the angels, rose from their places. Their faces turned away from the tent, away from Abraham, and fixed like flint toward the east, toward the valley, toward Sodom. The 2 angels began to walk toward the doomed city, their mission of investigation now active. But Abraham remained standing before the 3rd visitor, the Lord himself. It was here, in the vacuum left by the departing angels, that the true weight of the encounter was revealed. The Lord looked at Abraham, not just as a servant, but as a confidant, a partner in the covenant. The divine monologue that follows is unprecedented. The Lord spoke as if reasoning with himself, yet he ensured Abraham heard every syllable, pulling back the curtain of eternity to reveal the gears of divine history. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" the Lord asked. It was a rhetorical question that affirmed Abraham's status. "Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him." God was validating the relationship, confirming that because Abraham was the father of the future, he had a right to know the fate of the present. He had been chosen to command his children to keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice. And because Abraham was the standard-bearer of righteousness and justice, he had to be brought into the loop regarding the execution of those very principles. Then the hammer dropped. The Lord turned his gaze to the horizon, where the green valley of the Jordan shimmered deceptively in the distance. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great, and their sin is exceedingly grave. The word outcry here is specific, visceral. It is not the sound of a party. It is the sound of a victim. It is the shriek of the oppressed, the groan of the abused, the stench of rampant violence and perversion rising like black smoke before the throne of God. It was the echo of social injustice and selfish materialism that had reached a critical mass. The sin of Sodom was not passive. It was aggressive, a malignant tumor that had metastasized beyond any hope of surgical removal. God declared, "I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me." This was the divine investigation. God acts based on evidence, on the outcry of the victims. He was going down to verify the depth of the rot. The judgment hung like a sword over the proud cities, a dam of wrath ready to burst. At this moment, a deep chill ran down Abraham's spine. The theological implications were terrifying, but the personal reality was heart-stopping. Lot, his nephew, the boy he had raised, the man he had saved before, was sitting in the gate of that city. Abraham knew the character of Sodom. He knew the rumors, the stories of what happened to strangers there in the dark. And now he knew that the judge of all the earth was walking toward it with fire in his hands. His heart filled with anguish. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky, mirroring the violence that was about to be unleashed. Abraham did not retreat to his tent. He stepped closer to the Lord. He initiated a negotiation that stands as one of the most intense dialogues in the history of faith. He appealed to the very nature of God, to the character of the one who sat before him. This was not a plea for mercy for the wicked. It was a plea for the consistency of divine justice. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked. It was a bold, dangerous question. He was challenging the ethics of the destruction. Abraham began the count. "Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it?" He pressed the logic further, holding God to his own standard. "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" The tension in the air was palpable. Abraham was standing between the wrath of heaven and the ignorance of earth, using his position as a friend of God to build a shield for his family. And the Lord, in his infinite patience, accepted the terms. "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." But Abraham knew Sodom. He knew 50 was a fantasy. He felt the desperation rising in his throat. He lowered the number. "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? The countdown continued, a desperate auction for human lives. 45, 40, 30, 20. With every number, Abraham pushed the boundary of divine grace. And with every number, God agreed. "I will not destroy it," the Lord promised, "for the sake of the 10. 10 righteous people." That was the final threshold. Abraham stopped there, perhaps believing that surely, between Lot, his wife, his daughters, his sons-in-law, and their circle, there must be 10 people in that city who had not bowed the knee to the culture of depravity. He rested his case on the number 10, a fragile hope suspended over a pit of fire. The Lord went his way, the conversation ended, and Abraham returned to his place, the silence of the desert rushing back in. But the silence was different now. It was charged with a terrible anticipation. The 2 angels were already nearing the gates of Sodom, and the clock had started ticking toward midnight. Abraham stood alone in the twilight, watching the darkness swallow the plain, hoping, praying that 10 righteous souls could be found. But the tragedy of Sodom was that the corruption was far more absolute than even Abraham dared to imagine. The test had been set, the inspectors were at the door, and the city was about to prove that it was beyond redemption. Darkness does not fall upon Sodom like a blanket. It rises from the earth like a toxic vapor, choking the last gasps of daylight with a palpable sense of menace. As the sun began to bleed behind the distant western mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and violent orange, the city of the plain underwent a terrifying transformation. By day, it was a hub of commerce, a marvel of urban planning situated in the lush garden of the Jordan Valley. But as the shadows stretched, the veneer of civilization cracked, revealing the predator beneath. The air grew heavy with the humidity of the coming night, carrying on the wind the sounds of a city preparing not for rest, but for the hunt. It was into this deepening gloom that the two visitors walked. They had left Abraham under the terebinth trees of Mamre, carrying the divine warrant for an investigation that would end in fire. Now, they arrived at the massive gates of Sodom. To the casual observer, they were travelers, perhaps vulnerable, perhaps wealthy, their cloaks dusty from the descent into the valley. But their presence was like a lit match thrown into a room filled with gasoline. They moved with a silence that cut through the noise of the market, their eyes recording everything: the cruelty in the laughter, the oppression in the commerce, the spiritual stench that hung over the architecture like a fog. Sitting at the city gate was Lot. He had secured a position of prominence, a seat among the elders and judges, a man who had successfully integrated into the machinery of Sodom while trying to keep his soul intact. But as he looked up and saw the two strangers approaching, a jolt of pure adrenaline surged through his system. He didn't just see guests, he saw victims. He knew the unwritten laws of the sodomite night. He knew that in this city, hospitality was not a virtue. It was a weakness to be exploited. And strangers were not welcomed. They were devoured. Lot scrambled to his feet, his movements frantic, driven by a terrifying urgency. He rushed to meet them, bowing his face to the ground, not just in respect, but in a desperate bid to signal them, to intercept them before the rest of the city took notice. "Now, my lords," he whispered, his eyes darting to the shadows where eyes were already watching. "Please turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet to refresh yourselves, and in the morning you may rise early and go on your way." Note the specific timeline Lot proposes. Get in now, hide, and leave at first light. Do not linger. The angels, playing the role of the investigators, testing the moral fabric of the community, declined. "No," they said, their voices calm against Lot's panic. "We will spend the night in the open square." To Lot, this was a death sentence. The town square of Sodom after dark was not a place of public gathering. It was a hunting ground for the depraved. The idea of these two luminous beings sleeping in the open, exposed to the gangs and the predators that roamed the streets, terrified him. He pressed them vehemently. He begged. He pleaded with the desperation of a man who knows that their blood would be on his hands. He grabbed their cloaks, urging them, pulling them away from the public eye. Finally, seeing the sincerity of his fear and the reality of the danger, the visitors yielded. They turned aside with him and entered his house. Lot bolted the door. He moved with the manic energy of a man under siege, ordering a feast to be prepared, baking unleavened bread, a meal made in haste, without time for the yeast to rise, the food of refugees and those in mortal peril. They ate in the tense silence of a home that knows a storm is coming. But the walls of Lot's house were not thick enough to keep out the rot of the city. News of fresh prey travels at the speed of light in a culture obsessed with consumption. Before they could lie down, before the lamps could be dimmed, the sound began. At first, it was a low rumble, like distant thunder, the sound of feet shuffling on stone, of voices murmuring in the alleyways. Then it grew. It swelled into a roar that shook the very foundations of the house. The Bible gives us a description so chilling it defies exaggeration. The men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house. And then the detail that seals the city's fate. Both young and old, all the people from every quarter. This was not a rogue gang of criminals. This was not a niche subculture of deviance. This was the entire male population of the city. The grandfather and the grandson, the merchant and the beggar, the judge and the thief, united by a singular, demonic lust. They poured into the street outside Lot's door, a sea of angry, distorted faces, illuminated by the flickering light of torches, chanting, screaming, pounding on the wood until the hinges groaned. "Lot!" they screamed, their voices merging into a single, hydra-headed monster. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them." The Hebrew verb used here, yada, is shattered by the context. They did not want to interview the visitors. They did not want to check their passports. They wanted to know them in the biblical, carnal sense. They intended to gang rape the angelic visitors. It was an act of violence so profound, so aggressive, that it sought to humiliate and dominate the divine presence itself. It was the ultimate rebellion against the order of creation, the creature attempting to violate the messenger of the Creator. The mob wanted to turn the sacred law of hospitality into a crime scene. Lot was trapped. Inside were the angels he was sworn to protect. Outside was a civilization that had collapsed into total savagery. The pounding on the door became rhythmic, a battering ram of human bodies. In a moment of supreme cognitive dissonance, Lot made a decision that reveals just how deeply the toxic air of Sodom had infiltrated his own lungs. He stepped out. He squeezed through the door and shut it behind him, facing the wall of human rage alone. He raised his hands, trying to reason with a tsunami. "I beg you, my brothers," he shouted over the din, calling these monsters his brothers, trying to appeal to a shred of humanity that had long since evaporated. "Do not do such wickedness." And then, the words that freeze the blood of any modern reader. In a frantic, twisted attempt to barter for the safety of his guests, Lot offered a sacrifice that was just as hideous as the mob's demand. "Look, I have 2 daughters here who have not known a man. I will bring them out to you now, and you may do to them as you please." It was a horrific calculation. To save the male guests, he would feed his own children to the wolves. It showed that while Lot was righteous in comparison to Sodom, His moral compass had been demagnetized by years of compromise. He was trying to fight fire with fire, trying to appease a demon by offering it a different kind of flesh. But the mob was not interested in compromise. They didn't want the daughters. They wanted the strangers. They wanted the power of dominating the new, the foreign, the forbidden. They sneered at Lot, their eyes wild with bloodlust. "Stand back," they yelled. Then they turned on him with the fury of a pack that turns on its tamer. "This fellow came to sojourn," they mocked, pointing 1,000 accusatory fingers at him. "And he has become the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." The negotiation was over. The violence exploded. The crowd surged forward like a breaking dam, pressing hard against Lot, crushing him against the wood of his own door. Hands reached for his throat, tearing at his clothes, preparing to tear him limb from limb before they smashed the door to splinters. Lot was seconds away from being lynched, his breath crushed out of him by the sheer weight of the city's hatred. Then the supernatural intervened. The door didn't break, it opened. But it wasn't the mob that opened it. From the inside, hands of iron reached out, the hands of the angels. They grabbed Lot by the tunic, not with the desperate tug of men, but with the effortless strength of beings who can move mountains. They yanked him back into the safety of the house and slammed the door shut, locking it against the chaos. And then the counterstrike. The angels did not draw swords. They unleashed a weapon far more terrifying. They struck the men who were at the door with blindness. But this was not just a loss of sight. It was a confusion of the mind, a bewilderment that descended instantly on the young and the old. The roar of the crowd turned into screams of panic as their world went black. But here is the most horrifying detail of the night, the proof that Sodom was beyond saving. Even after they were struck blind, even after the supernatural power of God had physically assaulted them, the men did not stop. They did not fall to their knees in repentance. They did not flee in terror. Scripture says, they wore themselves out, groping for the door. Driven by a lust so consuming it overrode the instinct for self-preservation, the blind mob continued to scratch and claw at the wood, zombie-like, trying to find the handle, trying to break in, fueled by a depravity that was now literally blind to reality. The judgment of Sodom had already begun. They were dead men walking in the dark, scratching at the door of their own doom. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a miracle, a vacuum of sound where the human mind tries to reassemble a reality that has just been shattered. Outside the door, the mob of Sodom was not gone, but they were neutralized, a sea of writhing, blinded bodies stumbling in the dark. Their aggression turned into a pathetic, confused whimpering. Inside the house, the air was pressurized with a different kind of terror. The two visitors, who moments ago were potential victims, now stood revealed as the executioners of the Almighty. They turned to Lot, and the masquerade of the weary traveler was dropped completely. Their voices, now stripped of any human pretense, delivered the verdict that had been sealed in the courts of heaven. "Do you have anyone else here?" they asked. It was not a casual inquiry. It was an evacuation order. Sons-in-law, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here right now. The angels peeled back the curtain of the future and showed Lot the inevitable. For we are going to destroy this place. This was no longer an investigation. The evidence had been collected, The jury had voted, and the sentence was total liquidation. The outcry against the city had become so deafening that the Lord himself had authorized its erasure from the map. Lot, his mind reeling from the near lynching and the sudden blinding of his neighbors, now had to process the end of his world. The warning was absolute. Judgment wasn't a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. He rushed out into the night, slipping past the blinded men who were still clawing at his walls, and ran through the darkened streets to find the men pledged to marry his daughters. Imagine the scene. A respected elder of the city, breathless, his clothes torn from the earlier struggle, pounding on the doors of his future family, shouting about fire from the sky. "Get up quickly! Get out of this place at once! The Lord is about to destroy the city." But to the sons-in-law, raised in the cynicism and arrogance of Sodom, Lot looked like a madman. They were likely still drunk from the evening's revelry, their minds dulled by the hedonism that defined their culture. They looked at the sturdy walls of the city, the wealth, the sheer permanence of stone and mortar, and then they looked at this frantic old man. They laughed. They thought he was joking, perhaps suffering from a heat-stroke delirium or too much wine. "Destroy the city?" they mocked. "Go home, Lot. Sleep it off." They dismissed the apocalypse as a senile fantasy. Lot stood there, the only man in the city who knew the clock was ticking, watching the people he loved choose death because they couldn't imagine a world where their comfort could be interrupted. He returned home alone, crushed by the blind disbelief of those who were supposed to be his sons. The night bled away, and the first gray streaks of dawn began to stain the eastern sky. This was the deadline. The angels, sensing the precise alignment of divine wrath, abandoned all diplomatic protocol. They didn't ask Lot to leave. They commanded him. "Get up," they urged, their voices cutting through Lot's paralysis. "Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here. Leave now, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." But then, the most baffling and human moment of the entire catastrophe occurred. Lot hesitated. Scripture says he lingered. Why? Why would a man who has seen angels blind a mob, who has been told by God's messengers that the ground he stands on is about to be incinerated, stop to think? Perhaps he looked at his velvet tapestries, his gold, the title deeds to his properties, the life of comfort he had spent decades building. He was a righteous man, yes, but he was a righteous man infected by the materialism of Sodom. His feet were heavy with the gravity of his possessions. He was mentally bargaining, wondering if he could save just one more thing, or perhaps paralyzed by the sheer terror of walking into the wilderness with nothing. He stood on the precipice of destruction, frozen by an attachment to a dying world. The angels did not wait for him to find his courage. In an act of aggressive mercy, a grace that overrides human stupidity, the men seized him. They physically grabbed Lot's hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters. This was not a gentle guiding. This was a forcible extraction. The text explicitly states this happened because the Lord was merciful to him. Sometimes mercy looks like a kidnapping. Against their inertia, against their shock, the angels dragged them out of the house, through the streets where the blinded men still groaned, and out past the city gates. They didn't stop until they had pulled them safely outside the city walls, dumping them onto the open road just as the sun began to crest the horizon. The mission of rescue was technically complete, but the danger was critical. one of the angels issued a final, non-negotiable directive, a command that would become one of the most famous warnings in human history. Flee for your life. Do not look back under any circumstances. Do not stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains. The instructions were specific: distance and focus. Go to the high ground and do not mourn what you are leaving behind. But Lot, even now, breathless and terrified, began to negotiate with God. The trauma of the night had broken his nerve. He looked at the jagged, desolate mountains in the distance, wild, empty, filled with caves and predators, and his heart failed him. He couldn't go back to the city, but he was terrified to go forward into the wild. "Oh no, my lord," he pleaded, gasping for air. "I cannot flee to the mountains. Disaster may overtake me there, and I will die." He pointed a shaking finger toward a tiny, insignificant village nearby, a suburb of the Sodom complex. "Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." It was a pathetic request. Lot was asking to cling to a fragment of the civilization that was about to be destroyed. Just a little city. The angel, displaying the staggering patience of the Almighty, granted this concession. "Very well," he said. "I will not destroy the town you speak of." But then a revelation of the mechanics of judgment. "But flee there quickly, for I can do nothing until you reach it." This is a profound theological insight. The judgment of God was held back, dammed up in the heavens, waiting for one righteous man to get clear of the blast zone. The destruction was paused for Lot. Lot and his women ran. They sprinted toward the small town which would forever be named Zoar, meaning little or insignificant. They ran as the sun fully rose, casting its golden, ironic light over the beautiful, doomed plain. The birds were singing, the river was flowing, the farmers in the fields were starting their day, completely unaware that the atmosphere above them was destabilizing. And then, the moment Lot stepped into the safety of Zoar, the dam broke. The Bible does not describe a natural disaster. It does not speak of an earthquake or a volcano, though the earth surely shook. It says, "The Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven." This was an orbital bombardment. The Hebrew imagery suggests a deliberate, targeted downpour of burning brimstone. The sky didn't just rain. It opened up and vomited fire. A supernatural storm of superheated sulfur slammed into the cities of the plain with the force of a nuclear detonation. The smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. This wasn't a fire that burned buildings. It was a heat that vaporized stone. God obliterated the cities, the inhabitants, the vegetation, and the very topsoil. The fertile plain that Lot had coveted was instantly sterilized, turned into a desolate wasteland of ash and salt. The screams of the wicked were silenced in seconds, swallowed by the roar of divine incineration. The entire ecosystem was deconstructed, returned to chaos, wiped clean by the holy, consuming fire of Yahweh. But amidst the cataclysm, there was a tragedy that was smaller in scale, but infinite in sorrow. Lot's wife. She was running behind her husband, her lungs burning, the heat of the destruction radiating against her back. The command had been explicit: do not look back. It wasn't just a rule about eye direction, it was a command about the heart. To look back was to long for. To look back was to question the justice of the destruction. To look back was to attach oneself to the thing that God was destroying. And she looked. Was it curiosity? Was it the scream of a neighbor? Or was it the heartbreaking reality that her soul was still tethered to her home, her status, her life in the city? In a fatal second of disobedience, she turned her head, and the judgment that consumed the city caught her. The text is brutal in its brevity. She became a pillar of salt. It wasn't a slow transformation. In an instant, she was encrusted, calcified, frozen in the posture of longing. She became a monument to indecision, a mineral statue standing on the edge of the inferno, a warning to all generations that you cannot walk toward God while looking back at the world. Lot did not stop. He could not stop. He ran into Zoar with his daughters, a widower, a refugee, a man who had been saved by fire but had lost everything that mattered, leaving the statue of his wife standing watch over the burning ruins of his past. The sun rose over the valley of the Jordan, but it illuminated nothing but death. The smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace, a thick, choking column of black ash that blotted out the morning light and drifted across the wilderness like the ghost of a murdered civilization. From the high ridges of Hebron, Abraham looked down upon the devastation, witnessing the silence where there had once been the roar of commerce and the music of festivals. But the camera of history does not linger on the patriarch on the mountaintop. It descends into the shadows, tracking the chaotic, terrified movements of the only 3 survivors. Lot and his 2 daughters were alive, technically, but the man who stumbled through the gates of the small town of Zoar was a shell, a hollowed-out remnant of the wealthy judge who had sat at the gates of Sodom. They were refugees of a nuclear-scale event, their clothes smelling of sulfur and fear, their minds shattered by the sounds of 1,000 dying screams. Zoar was spared. The little city had been granted immunity solely because Lot was inside it. But Lot could not find peace there. The trauma of the night had rewired his nervous system. Every shadow looked like a judgment. Every rumble of the earth felt like the prelude to another bombardment. Paranoia, the faithful companion of the traumatized, whispered to him that Zoar was too close to the blast zone, that the fire would jump the gap, that God might change his mind. Driven by a fear that defied logic, the same fear that made him hesitate to leave Sodom, Lot uprooted his family again. He rejected the safety of the town God had granted him and fled to the one place he had initially refused to go, the desolate, wild mountains. It is a tragic irony that the man who once chose the lush, fertile plain for its comfort now ended his days in the cold, jagged sterility of a high-altitude cave. The narrative shifts from a disaster movie to a psychological horror played out in the dark. Lot and his 2 daughters settled into a cave, a hole in the rock that offered shelter but no home. The contrast is devastating. They had gone from the cosmopolitan luxury of urban palaces, from feasts and velvet and social status, to the primal existence of troglodytes. There was no furniture, no servants, no market, just the dripping of water on stone, the howling of the wind through the canyon, and the crushing weight of their isolation. In this cave, time seemed to stop. The world outside was gone, or so they believed. They were cut off from news, from other survivors, from Abraham. As the days turned into weeks, a suffocating despair settled over them. Lot, the patriarch, who should have led them in worship or gratitude for their survival, collapsed into a deep depression. He had lost his wife, his home, his wealth, and his dignity. He became a passive figure, a ghost haunting his own life, retreating into silence, and likely turning to the only comfort he had salvaged or could produce: wine. But while Lot sank into the past, his daughters looked at the bleak future, and their minds, warped by the culture they had just escaped, began to hatch a plan that was as logical as it was abominable. We must understand the psychology of these women. They were daughters of Sodom. They had been raised in a city where moral boundaries were fluid, where the self was an idol, and where the ends always justified the means. Furthermore, their perception of reality had been shattered. From the mouth of their cave, looking out at the smoking crater that used to be their world, they genuinely believed that the apocalypse had been total. They convinced themselves that they were the last women on earth, or at least that there is no man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. They believed the human race had been wiped out, or that they were so tainted by their origin that no outsider would ever touch them. This was not lust. It was a desperate grasp for immortality. In the ancient world, to die without descendants was the ultimate erasure. They were terrified that their lineage, the bloodline of Lot, would vanish into the darkness of that cave. And so the trap was set. It is a scene of grotesque reversal. The daughters became the predators, and the father, the protector, became the prey. Night fell over the mountains, the darkness of the cave illuminated perhaps by a dying fire. They brought the wine. Cup after cup, they fed their father the numbing nectar of the vine. Lot, eager to drown the screams that still echoed in his memory, drank willingly. He drank until his senses dulled, until the cold rock floor felt soft, until the moral laws of God and nature dissolved in a haze of intoxication. The Bible says he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. He was physically present, but spiritually absent. A man so broken, he became a passive instrument in his own violation. The older daughter went in. In the silence of the cave, an act was committed that violated the most fundamental structures of the family. A desperate attempt to create life out of the ashes of a death-filled world. The biological consequences of those nights in the cave would ripple through history for centuries, shaping the geopolitical landscape of the Promised Land. Both daughters became pregnant. The text records the births with a dry, factual tone that belies the horror of their conception. The firstborn, the son of the older daughter, was named Moab. The name itself is a confession. It sounds like the Hebrew phrase, "from father." He would become the father of the Moabites. The younger daughter also bore a son and named him Ben-Ami, meaning son of my people or son of my kin. He became the father of the Ammonites. These were not just children, they were nations in embryo. And here lies the bitter, stinging irony of the story. Lot had chosen Sodom for its prosperity, and he lost everything. He fled to the mountains to save his life, and he lost his honor. And from this cave of incest and shame rose two nations that would become the perpetual thorns in the side of Israel. The Moabites and the Ammonites would grow into powerful kingdoms, idol-worshipping neighbors who would seduce Israel into sin, war against them, and stand as enemies of the people of God. The sexual perversion of Sodom, which God had destroyed with fire, had managed to survive in the hearts of Lot's daughters, carried out of the flames and replanted in the darkness of a cave, proving that you can take the person out of the city, but taking the city out of the person requires a miracle of grace that Lot's family did not possess. The story of Lot ends here, in the silence of the cave. We never hear from him again in the pages of Genesis. There is no redemption arc, no triumphant return to Abraham, no rebuilding of his fortune. He fades into the mists of history, a tragic figure who serves as a living warning. He was a righteous man who saved his soul but lost his life's work, his family, and his legacy to the slow, creeping corruption of compromise. He stands as a monument to the fact that salvation, as through fire, is a terrible thing, to be stripped of everything but one's breath. But the echoes of this story do not stop at the mouth of the cave. They reverberate forward, all the way to the end of the age, asking us to look into the mirror and ask the terrifying question: if the fire fell today, what would be left of us? Would we be pillars of salt, frozen in longing for a dying world? Would we be broken men hiding in caves, numbing our pain? Or is there another way? And now, we must step back from the ancient precipice and look at the strange, twisted wreckage of this narrative to find the piece of shrapnel that is meant for us. This is not just a story about a bad city and a good God. It is a story about the terrifying persistence of seed. Here is the subversive twist that flips the entire narrative on its head. We look at the fire and brimstone and think that was the main event. We think the power of God was most visible in the destruction. But look closer. The true horror and the true power is not in what was destroyed, but in what survived. Sodom was burned to ash, yes, but Sodom survived. It didn't survive in the buildings or the streets. It survived in the software of the daughters' minds. They carried the twisted logic of the city, that survival justifies sin, that the end justifies the means, right through the judgment, and re-established it in the cave. The monster wasn't the fire. The monster was the idea that we can secure our own future by violating the laws of reality. We spend our lives terrified of the external fires, the market crashes, the wars, the pandemics, while the real danger is smuggled out of the crisis in our own backpacks. The seeds of our own destruction are rarely the things that happen to us. They are the compromises we carry within us. This connects to you right now in the 21st century. We are all Lot. We all have our Sodoms, those careers, relationships, or habits that we know are toxic, but they offer us comfort, status, or easy wealth. We linger. We negotiate with our conscience. We try to live in the suburbs of sin, in the little city of Zoar, thinking we are safe because we aren't in the blast zone. But the trauma of compromise follows us. How many of us have escaped a toxic situation only to recreate it in our next relationship? How many of us have left a soul-crushing job only to build the same frantic, anxiety-ridden culture in our own startups? We are masters at carrying the infection into the lifeboat. We numb ourselves with our own versions of wine, distraction, entertainment, substances, to avoid facing the reality of our choices. And in our drunken stupor, we birth consequences that will fight against our potential for generations. So here is the binary choice that this ancient tragedy forces upon you. It is not a choice between a city and a mountain. It is a choice between amputation and infection. Do you have the courage to cut the tie completely, to walk away from the burning city and, this is the hard part, leave the mindset of the city behind? Or will you carry the seeds of your own destruction into the cave, nurturing the very thing that will eventually rise up to wage war against your soul? Do you choose the painful, empty silence of the wilderness where God can heal you, or the comfortable, numbing darkness of the cave where you can breed your own monsters? The fire has fallen. The smoke is rising. The choice is yours. But remember, the most dangerous things are not the ones behind you in the flames. They are the ones sitting next to you in the dark. If you want to understand how to survive the cave without losing your soul, and how the lineage of Abraham eventually produced a solution to the mess Lot made, you need to witness what happens next. The story isn't over. The war between the children of the light and the children of the cave is just beginning. Subscribe now or be left in the dark.